Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is David Sanders. I'm a Managing Director at Results Healthcare. For those of you that haven't worked with us yet, Results Healthcare is a leading sector specialist mid-market advisory firm with offices in London, New York, and Singapore. We work with business owners and investors on M&A and fundraisings. I'm actually talking to you from our offices today, which feels good. So those of you that tuned into our last webinar will know that I was talking from a searingly hot upstairs bedroom on Wi-Fi, which I think was laid down around the same time as the London sewer system. But yes, thanks for joining, wherever you're joining from. Our topic today is the UK children's services market, and in particular, whether the future might bring a change in outlook for a sector which over recent years has performed very strongly. To help us explore that, I am very happy to be joined by a panel of 3 sector leaders whose organisations have had a major role in shaping children's services in the UK. Firstly, Kamran Abassi is Managing Director and co-founder of Care for Children, a specialist provider of children's homes, schools and fostering. Kamran has worked in the care sector for over 20 years, most of which has been spent in senior operational and board level roles. I'm also joined by Joe August, one of the most experienced and successful leaders in the fostering sector in the UK. Joe has spent more than 20 years in the sector and is CEO at the recently renamed Polaris, which was formed from PICS and Core Assets Group. And I'm delighted to welcome Richard Cooke, Group Commercial Director at Outcomes First Group. Richard has over 15 years experience of working within the care, education and mental health sectors, both in the UK and globally. And prior to joining Outcomes First, he was the Business Development Director at Options Group and has also previously worked for the Priory Group. Now, before we get into the discussion, I do want to share some slides. I'm going to march through them quite briskly, but I do think it's important just to set the scene a bit before we launch into a debate around where we see this sector going, especially for those that are new to it. And I think the starting point for any discussion about children's services has to be the children and the young people themselves. It's easy to fall into the trap, I think, myself included, of globally throwing around stats around the market growth and investment highlights. We shouldn't flinch from the reasons why this care is required in the first place. And of course, the bottom line for any operator is how much they can improve the prospects of the children in their care. It's also important to recognise the diversity of needs within the sector. So as most of you will know already, the distinction that you usually see is between special education or SEN and looked after children, which covers fostering, residential care and other settings. But even within those, there are wide variations in the level of acuity and the nature of the skills that are required to deliver the care. So when we're talking today about children's services, it's really these areas that we mean. And a common theme across these segments is that for the children themselves, lockdown has often been especially difficult. It's loaded extra layers of anxiety and instability on a group of people who really need the exact opposite. And we've included some recent headlines there at the bottom of the slide, which give a sense for the heightened risk that young people are facing. And it will be great to hear in a moment from our panel about how they've met the challenges that the lockdown has posed. In terms of size and structure, children's services is a large market. So in England alone, the total spend between SEN, special education, and looked after children is about £10 billion, depending on how you segment it. That comes from various pockets, but overwhelmingly from state spending rather than from the families themselves. And fostering and residential care, while the pie chart makes them look like smaller subsectors, they are all in themselves very substantial billion-plus areas of care. The drivers of this market have been positive for several years now. So pretty much regardless of setting, good operators have been able to show consistently growing numbers requiring care, consistently solid funding, even as other areas were cut during the period of austerity, and a consistent gap between the demand for care and the capacity available. Add to that the scope to expand through converting or building new capacity, and the scope for M&A in what remains a fragmented sector, and you actually have one of the strongest markets within care in the UK. So it's no surprise that pre-COVID, the expected growth in the children's services market benchmarked well against other areas within care. And it's no surprise also that there had been quite a lot of M&A activity too. So one of the things that we'll be testing today is whether that really attractive investment case is still intact as we come out of the lockdown. So that's probably more than enough for me. So let's bring the panel in, and we can move on to the discussion. And perhaps a good place to start is the lockdown itself. It'd be good to understand from our participants what the experience has really been. So we speak to operators across a range of different areas of care, and of course, as you'd expect, the experience has differed widely. It'd be great to get your views on how things were in operational terms in children's through the lockdown, and perhaps if we begin with you, Kamran, on what the scale of challenge was for your business.
Thank you very much, David. I think probably context, slight context really, from my perspective. There's no panacea. I think it's about sharing challenges and good practice. My views on behalf of Care for Children are broadly around the SEMH sector. So, there's other sectors that we should consider, albeit the challenges will be probably very similar. So really it's about looking at it from that context. I suppose the context of Care for Children is we are 110 plus days in now of the COVID-19 breakout. It's been the most challenging, unprecedented period of my professional and personal career, but also the most rewarding in terms of how I've seen people come together really in the best interests of young people. I've spoken to a lot of colleagues who are in other organisations, and it's really applaudable in terms of how our frontline workers, senior managers have worked together to provide as much stability. You rightly point out it's about the young people first and foremost. I'm really pleased that you've put them at the forefront of the conversations. Again, my context is we've got 30 settings, children's homes, schools, fostering, 160 plus children, 300 FTEs, 45 fostering households. We work across England and Wales, and that encapsulates 3 regulatory bodies, Public Health England, the Welsh Health Authorities, over 50 different local authorities, and also investor relation management. So a very big stakeholder group of people that we've been working with. So I think really that's the context, I suppose, in terms of our experience. The young people, it's fair to say, absolutely remarkable. The children that we deal with have got significant adverse childhood experiences, profound mental health issues that manifest from early childhood trauma and other discussions, which we could probably speak about all day. It manifests itself in a number of ways, including, impulsive risk-taking behaviour. They've absolutely been remarkable. It's not been plain sailing. There's been some profound challenges for them, but what we've done is really focus heavily on their well-being, try and give them as much normality as possible within the lockdown situation that we found ourselves in. So the well-being agenda, from our perspective, our in-house clinical team, so we don't have an outsourced model, have turned the volume up in terms of direct support for the children, but very importantly for the workforce, because of if you don't have a workforce that's stable, feeling secure, it'll compound the safety and security for young people. So that's been really important. We've widened our well-being agenda for children. We've introduced more mindfulness, more yoga. We also looked at very early on predisposed health conditions that may make young people more susceptible to coronavirus. Quite a significant investment in gym equipment, games, us understanding that they're going to be locked down on site, for want of a better word, with minimal external movement, board games, arts, crafts, whole raft of IT equipment. A very big thing, like I've said, is really around continuity. So we have 2 school offerings. The majority of what we have are what are called co-located sites. They operate on site with a separate children's home, separate clinical suite, and it's been fundamental really to continue those operations. It's given our care workers respite when children have gone in school. Very importantly, it's given children respite from the carers, so it's not becoming a melting pot. And hopefully Joe and Richard probably can speak more expansively on fostering, but we've found some households particularly challenging because of the melting pot of not having the ability for respite. But speaking in relation to our school or our co-located offering, we've operated them as 3 separate distinct sites or settings. So, we're minimising the footfall of people coming through our services. We still deem it as a safeguarding issue. We made some very early decisive calls in relation to minimising footfalls. So we have one large academy site where a number of children from our own children's homes and also day students go to, and we made an early call to basically close that site because the footfall was circa 400 plus people. So if we had an outbreak there, it would really have a profound impact. So we made a very early decision to close that site down and provide a really good alternative virtual offering, which was, trial and error, live teaching like this, accompanied with online training. We built in mindfulness at the front end of the day, physical activity. So just breaking up the day as best as possible for the young people. Very big issue around family contact, as you can imagine, for the young people. Huge issue. So it's about, we've used social media through additional IT equipment to make contact as available as possible during the pure lockdown period of time, which definitely helped young people stay connected, especially when we've got out of area children who have got arrangements to go back, to their place of origin, the family. So making IT availability to facilitate safe, appropriate contact, so those links could be maintained. And similarly with external visitors, so check-ins. So I've done in excess of 100 check-ins to our services. I've spoken to children, reassure them, praise them, equally with our workforce. So quite a lot of governance and check-ins via Microsoft Teams and other tools that we've become far more acclimatized to.
Thanks, Kamran.
That's the children perspective.
Yeah, no, I understood, and that's useful context, and really cheering to hear that theme, which actually we've heard many times, of staff and service users really stepping up and being adaptable and going beyond what was expected, really, to make things work. Joe, if I might pass on to you, is Kamran's experience one that echoes?
Yeah, it is. I mean, Polaris is, we're 90% fostering, so we look after 4,000 children across the whole of the UK. So that's been our main priority, is sorting out the fostering side of things. I echo what Cam says about most of the stuff. The families and the children and the staff have been amazing. We anticipated more issues than we've actually seen. We've had real stability within our placements with our family and children. That's been really quite an eye-opener about how well the children have responded to lockdown. And actually now we're coming out the other side, we're seeing the issues about them reintegrating into school and environments like that. So and we've done all the same things that Cam's got. It's around the respite, the contact, how we facilitate all of that, how we make sure the families are still supported, especially when we were doing less face-to-face contacts. So that's been really important, and we've learned to do all sorts of new things on Teams with families and quizzes and different events. And actually, I have to say, the engagement from families now is much higher than it was pre-COVID. So for us, there's a huge amount of learning about what happens next, because this has been really positive in so many ways, despite all the awfulness of it. So we've had a good spell through COVID.
Let's explore that in a second. I'm keen to talk through, what some of the lasting positives will be. But perhaps just before that, should we hear how things were at OFG, Richard? Because I guess your setting is different from Polaris and different from Care for Children.
Yeah, I think, it came at an interesting time for us because we were in a kind of large integration program following the activity of last year. So I guess just to put it in scale, we're about 4,500 employees, about 6,500 young people across fostering, residential care and our SEN. And really, I guess I would echo everything that Joe and Cam have said. I think what I'd add to it is it's really helped us as a group also gel more. We've kind of drawn from each different division. we've certainly brought education much closer to residential care. I mean, it's always been part of the offer, but more that collegiate spirit of staff helping each other and helping each other, in the times of crisis. So I think that's been some of the advantages from a staff piece. I mean, we focused a lot on communication, so we had daily bulletins to every member of staff. We had a 3-tiered business continuity planning for daily that then got communicated out. That was for different levels within the group, really to make sure that we had a fully kind of coherent and cohesive plan from top down and bottom up in terms of how we could then react and support the issues that were arising as quickly as we possibly could. I think the final piece for us was we had Acorn Digital Learning, which was an online learning platform, which was at its infancy in January, and now has all of a sudden rocketed into something that's actually hugely well established, that we certainly wouldn't have been at had we not had the unfortunate circumstances of COVID. So we quickly got about 500 teachers within 2 weeks trained for online learning, and we mobilised all the young people, which was about just over 1,100 within our schools, onto an online learning platform. So, we can confidently say that the education for the young people during the process, albeit would never be the same as attending school. Certainly from my experience in my personal life, in terms of my children and their schooling, Acorn Digital Learning has definitely provided a great platform and a great solution to keep the young people engaged in education. So, there's some of the benefits really that we've seen in terms of coming together as a group, really, and drawing on strengths from different areas.
So then, as we look ahead at the operational level, leaving aside the kind of big picture questions around market growth and funding, at the level of running a home or running a school, what do we think the future is going to hold? Is it going to look very different to a year ago? And perhaps, Kamran, if I begin with you again on the SEMH side.
I think lockdown, David, has to a degree been easier because of the restrictions of social bubbles and movements. So the real challenge, I would say, is probably ahead of us in terms of how we socially reintegrate and access to more services, and how, until a vaccine is available, how you contain and manage the risk of reinfection rates. So it's about sensible steps, definitely. And echoing what Richard said, very early on, we put together a phase 1 business continuity plan, which was about prevention and delay, a real emphasis in that particular area. So that included, workforce training, it included access to PPE, it had virtual teaching, so should anything happen, then this is how we operate. So we almost went to a virtual offering in several functions, especially around our head office and our big academy site. Hygiene stations were made available, enhanced benefits for staff. How does that translate going forward? Well, it's interesting because just after the infamous Super Saturday, we had to deal with, so we've had, in the broad context of the experience for us, we've had at the outset about 41 people in the first couple of weeks, levels of anxiety, naturally, who self-isolated. It's the fear of the unknown, and that's, we try to normalize that, saying that's it's okay to feel that way, to provide that additional well-being strand. So from our perspective, it was managing the initial anxieties, providing high levels of reassurance, like Richard said, daily, much higher levels of communication, the thank yous, checking in with the staff members, speaking to them individually, asking them about their families, seeing them as a whole person, because they're also, sacrificing, taking risk, and lots of things on a daily basis. We put together hygiene stations. Like I said, our schools, slightly different, have low pupil numbers because they're connected mainly to the children's homes. So the footfall is very small. We've not reintegrated our main school yet, which will be the challenge, I would say, for us in terms of a larger volume of people coming together. So our smaller locations, as it stands, will continue operating as separate settings. PPE availability, maintaining as best as possible the social bubbles that we've got inside the organisation, but also encouraging our colleagues who we work with to just be responsible when they're outside of work, because that's something that we can't control other than encouraging people who have got a key worker status to manage their social bubbles outside of work. And interestingly, after Super Saturday, we had one case that landed in on a Monday. So we've had 6. So phase 2 of our business continuity plan was about live incident management. So in an actual situation, what do we do? And thankfully, during the period of time that we've been in this particular pandemic, we've had one household that had to isolate, and the team managed that brilliantly well in terms of how they isolated and provided additional support, including practical things like shopping and additional PPE to those households. And then we had one in a children's home, and it raised a couple of other issues really around peripatetic workers as well, because some of our, no different to other organisations, you'll have a regional manager or responsible individual or a clinician who might go from one setting to another setting, and it's how that can potentially compromise those sites. So we found ourselves in a situation where one person had tested positive, and the ramifications were across 5 settings, including our head office. So that person obviously was sent home or told us didn't come in, obviously supported the individual through that process. And then we basically, the 2 primary sites, and we had 3 secondary sites, they essentially became locked down in the sense of the schools and the clinical were virtual, and we isolated the home insofar as the children and staff. And again, remarkable levels of, I suppose, cooperation. We had testing done virtually the same day, the next day, results coming back. So within the space of 3 or 4 days, we had 70 odd people tested. Everybody came back negative, including the children, and it was isolated to this one staff member. Deep cleaning, and as best as possible went back to normal operations. And what we underpin that with is, Richard said it, one of the really great things is we've had a dedicated COVID-19 email. We've had daily calls, as in Monday to Friday. Our senior management team have been on that call, and really that has been to give them a secure base and just give them reassurance that they can ultimately cascade down to their teams, monitor levels of PPE at site level, monitor what's going on for the children from a well-being point of view, the workforce, and then try to be ahead of the curve really in terms of our support. So yeah, it's cautious, appropriate steps, and I think it's just about responsiveness. And I think one of the things I would say, definitely from Care for Children's point of view, and I'm sure Joe and Richard will say the same, as the versatility and responsiveness that the sector has shown really, and it's about maintaining that rather than having a rigidity to something that is yet to be.
It must have been a relief that the turnaround time was pretty short on the COVID tests, because I imagine that would have been a deeply unwelcome source of extra stress.
Absolutely. And these things, opportunities, these difficult opportunities, difficulties create opportunities. So it's allowed us to refine our business continuity plan for live incident management better. So a slightly different approach to peripatetic workers and more frequent testing for those who are going across multiple sites. So it does nothing but improve our ability to deal with additional live cases.
And Richard, you mentioned Acorn Digital Learning. I imagine that will be one of the permanent changes that will affect how OFG works and delivers care. Once, thinking optimistically, once we're some months down the track and hopefully post-vaccine, and the hazard tape has gone and hand sanitizers have gone, where do you see the changes? Where do you see the innovation and the lasting positives and lasting differences really?
I think I'd come back to how well it's facilitated our integration really. So I think there would certainly, moving forward, there will be much more cross-group engagement, and that was always something that we'd identified as something that we were working towards. So we'd already kind of put structures in place to force that, and so to speak, but actually it's become naturally because of the crisis that we've had to work under. So I would certainly see that staying as is and developing for the better moving forward. I think that it's also made us think more creatively, perhaps when young people can't access an education setting for whatever reason it is, not necessarily to COVID, but it could be anything. Then actually now we've got the functionality to be able to still engage with those young people, either be it temporarily or permanently. So I would see that. I mean, we've still got a huge appetite in the sector. The priority is to continue to look after these young people. So in terms of how it looks going forward, we'd be looking really just to take the best of what we've learned so far, plus that joint working, continuing to deliver the best standards and outcomes that we can, really.
Thank you. Joe, a question for you specifically around fostering, but I guess, again, looking at the future, do you think that the mechanism for bringing foster parents in to the sector will look different as we come out of lockdown?
Yeah, I think it will. Recruitment has boomed during this period of time. People are at home, people are furloughed, people have lost work. So there's a lot of activity going on, and we've had to look at how we do it safely but creatively by doing everything online to an extent. It's from assessments, you're not necessarily seeing families in person, or you maybe once, that's it, that type of thing, getting them in panels, getting panels laid on, but doing it virtually. So we've had to navigate all of that stuff, which we've done. And actually some of the learnings in there are things that we want to keep hold of. You don't want to lose the face-to-face stuff, but actually you can do an awful lot online, and you can move things on more quickly. And actually it's a better experience for the families that are wanting to come through the process in some ways. So it will be a mix of both. We certainly wouldn't want to stay all online as we are currently, but we will want to keep some of that because it's beneficial to everybody involved.
And I guess we touched on workforce and how we've seen them step up. Staffing is, of course, a perpetual challenge for lots of areas within care. Do you see, as you've seen it with foster parents, the approach changing? Do you see the landscape changing in terms of recruitment and retention as well?
It's probably not so relevant for us. I mean, we have quite a steady staff force because it's social workers. We haven't got a high turnover because we haven't got any residential homes or anything. So we've managed, staff has just stayed the same. We've been recruiting to posts, and actually we've still been able to recruit even during this period of time. We have got a leaving care service where we had more agency previously, but now we've got a more steady staff team during this period of time, so we'd like to see that continue. But we haven't I don't see staffing actually changing that much because we have quite a low staff turnover anyway.
Richard, you've got a different balance of staff within your business, and I guess certainly many more care home staff. Do you see the equation changing in the future?
Yeah, I think to a degree we will do. I think it's too early to say at the moment. Clearly, with unemployment increasing, then from a recruitment perspective, it makes life on that side a little bit easier. But what I would say is that recruitment on the whole isn't attracting the attention isn't necessarily the issue. It's getting the right people and getting them to stay in post is the real test. And that's why I touch on it being slightly too early, because I would imagine that Cam and Joe's experiences are the same, that you tend to have a hiatus of people coming in and leaving quite quickly, and it's those who stay that really make the difference in terms of the lives of the young people. So I think we will see the change in profile. I think whilst the industry hasn't had as much profile through it as perhaps obviously the NHS has, we've certainly got a heightened profile as an industry as a consequence, and it would be good to see some benefit of that. I mean, I'd certainly echo Joe's comments on the foster care recruitment side of things. We've seen a completely different profile of carer starting to apply. So you've got your traditional carers who we would expect to attract, but we've got carers from professions that we would have never previously attracted attention from. So I would certainly echo Joe's comment around the changing in kind of landscape around foster carers. But I would imagine we'll see the same as well in general recruitment for the schools and care homes.
Kamran, would you share that?
Absolutely. I think with the bite of recession and the level of people who are out of jobs, tragically, as one of the casualties, we've managed to, my HR team have been remarkable, as have my operational team. We've managed to recruit over 50 people during the COVID-19 period, and again, very innovative around assessments, interviews, inductions through virtual means, and then how they are sort of transitioned into the services or the department that they're actually working in. So turnover has been minimal outside of our very initial heightened anxiety state of people self-isolating. You know, now we've got 6 people who are shielding for the right reasons, and that's it. So sickness absence is reduced remarkably from the initial wave, and staff retention has been really high, and we're adding to that workforce. And you know, there'll be lots of opportunities for people with different industry transferable skills from retail, hospitality, tourism, who can, you know, with the right support, training, coaching, could be very good caregivers, whether that's in a fostering household or in a residential or education setting.
Thank you. And just moving on to perhaps some of the drivers of the market. I guess the crisis has been a challenge, of course, for commissioners as well as for operators. And it's always difficult to generalize about commissioner behaviour, but I'm still going to ask you to. Are there any clear patterns that you would highlight? And perhaps, Richard, if I put this to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, depends how far down the line you go from commissioning to placement, but certainly during COVID, whilst we were active in terms of placements, we weren't as active as we usually would have been. Engagement with commissioners was slightly slower, assessments more difficult. I think that on the whole, the picture I've seen is clearly those who are familiar with the children's market will understand the framework principle of the way that local authorities commission placements. We've certainly seen a massive delay in either those frameworks coming to market, those frameworks deferring potentially for opening dates, deferring review dates. So I think from a pure commissioning perspective, that's been the biggest impact that we've recognised so far. And, you know, again, those who are familiar with it, that has a number of consequences around, you know, potentially fees, uplift opportunities, you know, potentially, you know, negotiating fee discount arrangements around bulk. All of that fits into those windows of opportunity. So as they move, your whole kind of modelling piece also moves with it. So that's certainly probably from a pure commissioning perspective has been the greatest dynamic that I've experienced so far.
Joe, what patterns have you seen in terms of commissioner behaviour?
Referrals have remained exceedingly busy within fostering. Sadly, you know, there's a large number of children that have needed to move during this time, and we've had some amazing families that have been willing to risk assess and do that work. From a commissioning point of view, I think the engagement with commissioners has been better, because there's more Teams calls, it's more personal again, instead of just the round robin emails that come out on the frameworks. And one of the best takeaways from me with the commissioners during this time is when children have had to move, it's notoriously difficult to get children to meet families before they move in. And a large number of the children are moving in an emergency situation anyway. What we've seen and what we really want to keep hold of moving forward is we've been able to do introductions through WhatsApp or different mediums, and that's been really good because actually the kids are getting to see where they're going, the families are getting to meet the kids. It's so much better for them, and it's something we've struggled with for years. So if we can keep that going moving forward, that would be a real asset.
Thank you. Kamran, would you echo that?
Absolutely, yes. So demand pre-COVID was on the increase, and for a number of reasons, including I think we'll look at the long-term outlook, but the challenges that high unemployment rates, people at home, additional issues around domestic violence, mental health, and everything else, it creates more demand, essentially. And I think the things that Joe has discussed around virtual visits and everything else has been really useful, especially as a national catchment service provider. So we take children from all over the country into our services. So whether there were restrictions on travel, being able to video call in and manage that has been really useful. I think local authorities, there's been some innovation. You know, I would say we were approached by several to look at, proactively look at just taking our available beds on a retained basis and placing children there as and when their needs arose, which was, you know, really collaborative, innovative thinking, and not something ordinarily that would happen. But the diligence around that was that just because that bed was retained, it wouldn't be any child going into that, it'd be the right child going into that. So absolutely. And also I think just the new services, we managed to launch 2 new services within this period of time, and no inspection history, and those services have been filling appropriately as well, and that's a strength of some of the work, or a lot of the work that we've done over the years, and we currently do with a number of local authorities who trust us with their children. So we've been able to fill services with no inspection history, because regulators registration and inspections is another issue that is, you know, has been is a discussion point within this time period. But you know, where we've been able to fill those services and, you know, manage the innovation and the demand in line with how we operate our services.
So I just want to pull out that point that you made early on there about volumes. Are you already seeing that increased caseload coming through the system, and do you see that caseload looking different to, you know, what you would have seen a year ago, 2 years ago?
I think, look, the benefit of sort of being in the sector for 20 plus years is that, you know, we've been through a previous recession as well, and we've seen the fallouts of the previous recession and the increase. And residential childcare, typically, you know, 8,000 odd children and slowly increasing, and, you know, fostering adoption has always had the largest service offering. I suppose we've seen more people being interested in coming into the sector, operator-wise and investor-wise. So the demand I can only see based on past history and not yet having the bite of the impact from an economic perspective. I can only see the demand increasing for fostering and for residential.
Joe, how do you think it looks in terms of timing? So, you know, I'm hearing from lots of operators and on this call that you know, step up in demand is already visible. Do you see that lasting some time? Is this a small blip, or can you see this playing out over a year or more?
Yes, sadly, I think it will increase for quite some time. We're speaking to the commissioners. We are already starting to see it increase. It's been busy all through this period. It's starting to go up. Local authorities are well aware that they've got a lot more young people that will sadly need our services. So they're expecting it to continue for some time. So I can't imagine this being anything less than a year or longer with what's going on.
Thanks. We also touched on regulators there. Perhaps if I pose this question to Richard, do you think that regulators, you know, both in England and outside England, have got the balance right in terms of, you know, maintaining standards but you know, supporting safety guidelines?
Yeah, I think they've been through an interesting time, like the rest of us. We've certainly found that from a regulator engagement on new services, it's been easier on homes than it has been on schools. So we've had both pending registration during the period, and homes have certainly been easier. I guess for me, the gap between regulators and actually what's happening on the ground is this spike in demand. There's providers who are able to provide the capacity to help meet that need, but we don't have a regulator who's as responsive. You know, I've got a number of local authorities where we've got new openings pending who are really pushing, because unfortunately, whilst some providers have fared well through this process, there's also been, or through this period, there's also been a number of pockets where there's been a number of closures. So there is a high demand in certain areas, and there's facilities available for people, but we're just not able to, as an industry, link up that regulator with the demand and the provider piece, unfortunately. But no, I think the return from Ofsted in September with the kind of informal partnership visits ahead of a new inspection routine is good. It'll be good to have them back out again. It's good to have them to engage with in that way. So, like I say, they've been on a learning curve as well. So I'm not as close to the face of it at a service level in terms of day-to-day engagement, but I think the return of them has been welcome. And, to get the inspection cycle going again, I think it's February time they're looking at, we would welcome.
And as we look at some of the other drivers of growth in the sector, funding is obviously a key one, and it's one aspect of the market that's been very positive over the last couple of years, certainly. Inevitably, when government debt inflates, the fear is that sooner or later the possibility of cutbacks returns for operators that are central government or local government funded. What level of risk do you see, Richard, for funding over the longer term?
I see it as low risk. I think that the services that we're providing are statutory services. We're always working with each of the authorities we engage with, and it's pretty much all across the UK. We're always looking at ways of how we can be more efficient. We only really engage on an annual basis with kind of inflationary related costs that would be generally dictated by the National Schools Framework. So I think as long as you're reputable, you're maintaining the quality, you're driving key outcomes for young people, then really from a funding perspective, then we should really be positioned as complementary to the mainstream offer. And we're dealing and working with some of the most difficult young people in the sector. So yeah, I would still have it as a relatively low risk in terms of the long term.
Kamran, have you seen any early indications that there might be a change of mindset on the part of commissioners around funding?
No, very similar to what Richard has said, really. I mean, our positioning in our residential services, high-end young people, so with that high risk, high vulnerability, there's a high level of protection around funding and also sourcing the right placement. So it's a relatively secure starting base anyway, in terms of safeguarding comes trumps, as does the complex presentation of young people. I think there might be, again, the pendulums swing slightly in terms of looking at commissioned local services, because I've been through a cycle with a colleague of mine where we provided the largest number of block contracts in the country. So, we were commissioned to deliver services for a huge number of local authorities, and then the pendulum swung to frameworks, spot purchase, regulate the market through frameworks where there's a number of local authorities coming together to drive quality and price. The demand has gone through the roof, so some of that strategy is moved on a little bit. You've seen market entrance and fees being very high, or being a secondary thought. So if anything, I can see probably a mixed economy of contracting services on a block volume basis to try and get value on price or better price from rather than a spot purchase. So I can see probably some movement again towards that particular area.
Thank you. We're going to turn to the audience Q&A in just a second, but one final question, and perhaps Joe, if I start with you. The stats on life prospects of care experienced children versus those in the mainstream are still quite painful to read. What one thing would you change if you could to close that gap?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's so many things that you'd change. Getting the right education facility for our children, whether that be vocational or academic or whatever, to give them, if we can give them the proper foundings of a stable environment to live in, and we can meet their educational achievements, whatever they are, however they are, then we've got the good basis between the two of getting them to achieve their full potential.
Thanks. And Richard, same question to you.
I'd say right placement first time. because we see far too many young people who, you know, I think it was on the Children's Commissioner Stability Index, who are moving placements, you know, anything up to, you know, 3 months. I think it was something like 75% moved 3 times in 12 months. I mean, nobody in the best will can generate routes and access education, therapeutic care, whatever angle it is that they desperately need when that kind of movement is continuously working in the sector. And we see more often than not when you know, young people are placed inappropriately, because you see them moving around from their history. So I'd say right placement first time. Not every time, won't get it right, but more of a commitment to that.
Yep, thank you. And Kamran, how would you?
Yeah, echo Richard has said, really, you know, needs-led rather than price-led decisions. So it's to understand the global, I suppose, the central government, the impact of the comprehensive spending review, the, you know, barriers to come in is potentially, has been previously a bit higher. So there's a lot of risk that's being carried at a local level. All of a sudden there's a crisis and there's a requirement for a complex child to have a same-day placement. Now, that's fundamentally wrong. From a provider point of view, to potentially take that placement on the same day, because how can you diligently say that that child is the right match for that placement? But also from a local authority point of view, there'll always be a need for emergency placement. Often the children that come into our care, there's a history and there's early missed opportunities. So if you can get the right placement at the right time for a child who's already got loaded with attachment issues, you know, breakdown, massive adverse childhood experiences, if you can get that first placement right, the long-term health, social, every outcome for that child should be better. The long-term cost savings for a local authority should see itself as well. And we've had children who've returned home and their care plans were to remain in local authority care for 18 years old. And, you know, it's trying to get those children at the right time where you can effect that real long-term change.
Thank you very much for those perspectives. So at this point, I'm going to pick out some of the questions that our audience have asked. So one question is, what do you feel will be the long-term strategies to address mental health issues arising from lockdown? And ideally, if there were no funding constraints, what should be done to address this? So we did touch on this a little at the start of the discussion. And Kamran, you mentioned the wellbeing initiatives you're undertaking. Perhaps this is one that I put to you.
The challenge, I suppose, the way we are set up at Care for Children, we provide our own clinical services. So there's no reliance on a local authority CAMHS service, which is already stretched. You know, the data for accessing CAMHS, even just from a referral to assessment point of view, is, you know, profoundly long for very complex children, and then to get the appropriate interventions is even longer. So it's from our perspective, it's, you know, making sure that at the front end we do really good assessments to say we can meet these children's needs, and our clinical team are a component to that. I think the wellbeing agenda from both a child's perspective and a workforce perspective, because there's a lot of, you know, counter-transference and transference around, you know, issues. So if your workforce wellbeing is not taken care of and they don't feel safe and secure, it will have an impact at some stage, consciously or subconsciously, on the children. So it's about making sure the wellbeing agenda, health and wellbeing of everybody from the actual children, and that includes physical exercise, mindfulness, you know, yoga, other things that might work for children, so be creative, art therapy, drama therapy, whatever it might be, you know, get the right thing for that child and stick with them and understand that they're going to go on a roller coaster ride. You know, their starting point is often very high levels of anxiety. It's about, you know, they don't have a relationship of trust with an adult because the primary carers in their lives, for whatever reason, aren't there. So this might be their 10th or 11th placement, and might be the 10th or 11th time somebody saying to them, oh, yeah, we're really going to care for you now. So the work and effort has to be through the workforce, that real commitment and dedication. And we have to look after our workforce. You know, it has to get the recognition that they deserve. They've been absolutely phenomenal. You know, my overall experience over 20 years is it's residential care predominantly has been the poorer relation of social work. So it's about getting parity when it comes to recognising the efforts. And this has been a remarkable insight, really, very privileging, very humbling, and just really emphasised why I'm still in this sector, my teams are still in this sector, in terms of their unconditional regard and sacrifices and overwhelming commitment to these young people. If a child,
I think that's, if I might state a personal view, I think that's actually happening. So I think, you know, we've been on our doorsteps clapping, not just for the NHS, but for carers.
Yes.
And that has lodged in a lot of minds that, you know, I hadn't really thought about the connections between the healthcare system and the social care system before. And hopefully some of those minds are policymakers' minds. So I am optimistic about that joined up thinking being more prevalent and parity of esteem between social care and healthcare. Another question from the audience. So this is a bit of this has a retro feel to it, this question. I'm going to pitch it to Richard. Do you think Brexit will have an impact on recruitment from 2021?
I think it's difficult to say. I think that possibly less of an impact in light of unemployment. So I'm not sure at what point we'll really experience the impact of Brexit. As a workforce, we had a relatively low percentage that were at risk as a consequence of Brexit. So we would have felt it more as a knock-on impact of other roles and employment that potentially was going to be filled by UK citizens. However, there's a lot of moving parts now, not just the one piece of Brexit. So I think it's going to be difficult to tell. That linked in with what you just said about the profile of the sector and people actually understanding more about it than they did. It's going to be hard to tell, but ultimately, you know, we as providers will have to adapt in by whatever means we need to be able to ensure that we can staff our facilities appropriately. So there has to be a way around it.
Thank you. And Joe, question for you on picking up on what we've been saying about right placement first time. In terms of that, what do you believe are the integral processes and development that those making decisions will need to address to achieve those outcomes?
The right placement first time is vital if we can achieve it at all times. It's a mix of local authorities have to share the full information on the young people that they're referring. We would always share all information with our families. We have to recruit the right type of families, getting them through, sharing that information, putting the right resources around the family and the child once they're in placement to work through any difficulties that do come up. And all of those things are vital, and even down to the introductory thing right at the beginning between the child and the family, that's a good stepping stone. So if we can put all those elements together and match appropriately, we've got a good chance of having success.
Thank you. Final question, and it's for you, Kamran. Has the lockdown changed the way that you're using technology to manage your business? It sounds like the answer is yes.
Yes, absolutely. We're using it more now as we speak. You know, 6-7 months ago, if somebody talked to me about using the facility like this, it would be, well, where do you start life? Absolutely, it's an enabler. It's the way. It's a balance, I suppose. You know, you can't do everything, as Joe and Richard have alluded to earlier. You know, that face-to-face humanistic interaction is really important when you're building relationships. So there is a definite space for it. We've used it very successfully to induct some of our workforce who would have had to travel, you know, a couple of hours otherwise. So it can reach to people's doorsteps. We've used it to check in on the children. So from a governance point of view, I don't have to travel 2.5 hours to one particular site. I could just zoom in, check in on the children and the workforce far easier, and then facilitate that with a visit. So I think blended, definitely, it has to be the way forward. Our children are more climatized to it than us. So people like me who are dinosaurs need to stay with the times and get ahead of the times. Yeah, definite place.
Thank you, Kamran. So I think that's us pretty much running out of time, so I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much indeed to our excellent panelists for sharing their insights today and for being generous with their time. Thank you to audience members for tuning in and being involved. I hope you found it useful. There will be a follow-up email that goes round which will have a recording of the webinar, so do look out for that. And as we come out of lockdown, it does feel like many companies and many sectors are at a crossroads. It's in those moments that good advice can really count. So do think of us at Results Healthcare as being here to help. Whether that's on a particular opportunity or just have a thought partner, please do get in touch. It'd be great to hear from you. So until we speak again, do keep well. Thank you.